The cinematic figure of the noble and righteous samurai warrior is deeply ingrained, but plenty of aspects of samurai life were less than honorable. Let's take a look at some of the most surprising ones. Seppuku is ritualistic suicide where a samurai slices his stomach open with a small sword. It emerged in the 12th century as an honorable way for a losing samurai to die on the battlefield. There were two basic methods. The more awful variation, Jumonji Giri, had the samurai cut open his abdomen vertically and horizontally, then wait for death and excruciating pain. However, most opted for the gentler variant, where a helper known as a kaishakunin decapitated them immediately after the first cut.
Why abdomen? Because that is the center of one's body, which contains the soul of man.
Outside the battlefield, seppuku was an elaborate process where the participants made a day out of it with rituals such as the writing of a death poem and having a good drink of sake before grabbing the blade. Usually there were spectators present. Samurai warriors could perform seppuku as a political protest or to show their overwhelming grief over the death of a beloved leader. It was also a form of death sentence. Shoguns and daimyos could command their underlings to perform seppuku for real or perceived slights, at which point the person had to follow through, lest he bring shame to himself and his entire family. Bushido code is one of the first things that many people associate with the noble samurai, but is it really what we think it is? Not quite. The original Bushido was just one of the assorted warrior guidelines in Japan's history. Their values often included things like fighting spirit, skill, duty, honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, but focused on different things and were by their very nature pretty martial. Since Bushido is the one we know today, surely it was the code that won some sort of samurai ethics tournament that everyone agreed to follow. Again, no. When the Meiji Restoration of 1868 ended the Edo period and essentially abolished the samurai class, samurai warrior values steered the loyalty aspect from the samurai's immediate master to a more generalized appreciation of the emperor and nation, and in the case of the country's Christians, even Jesus. Nitobe Inazo's 1899 book Bushido, The Soul of Japan, is arguably the most influential description of this reimagined Bushido in modern Japan, which is ironic because Nitobe's book was aimed at Western readers and retooled Bushido as a largely non-militaristic take on Western chivalry. Instead of samurai, Nitobe's Bushido is for everyone in Japanese society and focuses on the positive aspects of a loyal, humble, brave, and hardworking citizen. The samurai really started flourishing during the Edo period from 1603 to 1867, when they rose to the upper echelons of Japanese society and became the highest caste. However, their high social status didn't mean they were free to do whatever they felt like, at least when it came to marriage. Marriages of the Edo era were generally prearranged, and young members of the samurai class had it particularly bad. Apart from having their parents choose them a spouse from whatever family was deemed socially appropriate, they also needed permission from the daimyo and shogun before they could marry that person who was often a virtual stranger. This system made love marriages extremely rare, but that didn't mean people didn't still fall in love. Some young desperate lovers would commit suicide together when it became evident that their parents had other plans for their marital future. Katana swords are at least as cool and legendary as the samurai warriors who wielded them, and they've held a lot of ceremonial sway over the years. However, a katana is still a sword, which means it had to be tested before the swordsmith presented it to its samurai owner. The test was an elaborate process called tameshigiri, or test cut. This put both the sword and its user's skill to the test by cutting materials such as bamboo, wood, or armor.
Traditionally, samurai tested their technique on bamboo, which is said to have the same resistance to human bone.
If the katana or the man swinging it weren't up to the task, the sword could easily be ruined. Tameshigiri is still practiced today, but its dark subsection known as suemonogiri has hopefully gone the way of the dodo. Suemonogiri means the cutting of tied objects, and said objects were actual human bodies. The bodies were usually those of dead criminals, although live subjects were used on occasion. But using corpses didn't make the process any less gruesome, especially as the mutilation count was sometimes inscribed on the sword as a creepy seal of quality. The cut test cadavers could be stacked up to 7 bodies high, and they were sometimes so badly mutilated that the families of Tameshigiri subjects seeking to recover the remains could accidentally end up burying a Frankenstein body, hastily cobbled together from indistinguishable bits out of the bloody pile. One of the most terrifying traditions associated with the samurai was the tsujigiri. The term means roadside killing, and there's absolutely no hyperbole in that name. Though the practice had its roots in honorable dueling, it eventually twisted into a popular practice where members of the samurai class would unexpectedly slash at passing merchants and peasants. Sometimes there were vague excuses for these gruesome slayings, such as testing out a new weapon or practicing a strike. Other times, it was done simply because the samurai felt like it. There's even a legend floating around that performing 1,000 tsujigiri killings could cure illness. All in all, it wasn't a great time to walk out at night if you were a merchant or peasant. By 1602, tsujigiri ultimately became such a massive problem that the newly empowered Tokugawa officials prohibited it. Even then, the custom didn't go away overnight. Regular instances of tsujigiri were reported well into the Edo period, to the point that even the third Tokugawa shogun, Iemitsu, was rumored to sneak out of the Edo castle to chop up passerbys on the dark streets of his city. Most people are familiar with seppuku, the traditional samurai suicide method. However, there's another less famous method called jigai. It wasn't for the samurai himself, but for the female members of his family. It focused on swiftness and dignity instead of honor and pain tolerance. So instead of bringing a blade to their midsection, the woman would slice her own throat. Often she would also tie her knees together so she wouldn't be discovered in a compromising position. There were many reasons women of the samurai families would perform jigai, from atonement for bringing shame to her family to preserving her honor in the event of an enemy invasion. However, it was most commonly practiced by wives whose husbands had committed seppuku. In other words, a samurai's wife felt it necessary to ritually kill herself if her husband had messed up in some way. All things must come to an end, and Japan's feudal system sang its swan song on a battlefield near Kagoshima on September 25, 1877. Traditional samurai had resisted change because it stripped them of their power, and there had been several unsuccessful revolts. Now only the Satsuma clan samurai and their leader Takamori Saigo remained, and Saigo's initial attempts at peaceful negotiations with the government had ended in violence. The government sent 30,000 soldiers to face him. Saigo had 500 men who were so short on supplies that they had to melt trinkets into bullets, and their only medical supplies were a carpenter's saw and some rags. Saigo himself lived in a small hole dug in a hillside. As the Imperial Army hammered his positions with lethal artillery fire, Saigo resigned himself to his fate and had a final sake party with his closest friends. Early on the morning of September 25th, the Imperials stormed the samurai positions. 3 hours later, only 40 of Saigo's men were alive and their leader was mortally wounded.
He will kill us all. Then what have we got to lose?
Saigo had his follower Shinsuke Beppu take him to a hilltop and behead him. Afterward, Beppu and the remaining samurai drew their swords and charged the enemy. None survived. The samurai were surprisingly open-minded about same-sex relationships, which is pretty great. Arguably less great, however, is that they went about this with a system called Wakashudo, where younger men were required to become wakashu, trainees and field wives for older warriors. The older men would mentor, train, guide, and protect the wakashu until the young man finished this apprenticeship and joined the ranks of the warriors. According to James Neal's book, The Origins and Role of Same-Sex Relations in Human Societies, the role of wakashu had its roots in Buddhism, and it wasn't entirely voluntary. Young men were encouraged to embrace the wakashu role with teachings and sayings that heavily insinuated that a handsome youth who refused to yield to an older lover was acting shamefully. This in turn would hurt the wakashu's karma to the point that they risked a physical deformity in their next life. Fear is a powerful thing. Nowadays, we talk about adding insult to injury, but the samurai like to approach this concept the other way around. A practice known as kirusute gomen, authorization to cut and leave the body of the victim, allowed them to legally kill people whom they felt were disrespecting them, as long as they did it immediately after the supposed insult and the victim was of a lower social class. The insult and retaliation needed to be seen by a witness who could recount the events in court, although the samurai were allowed to use their own servants and friends as witnesses. While this makes it sound like every samurai had carte blanche to kill almost any merchant or peasant who looked at them funny, there were serious repercussions for anyone caught abusing the system. A samurai who was found to misuse his kirusute gomen privileges was given a severe punishment, which could be death by beheading as opposed to the more honorable seppuku, and his house being abolished so his sons could not inherit his title and position. What does a warrior do during a period of peace? Well, if he's a samurai, he might start wearing outlandish clothing, get a rebel haircut, and join a themed street gang to terrorize common folk and clash with other gangs like in the movie Warriors.
Warriors, come out to play!
The lack of respect and of wars to fight drove some bored and unemployed Edo period samurai onto the streets, where they joined other high-born kids to form strange gangs such as the Kabuki Mono and the Kyokaku. Kabuki Mono were a flamboyant group that eschewed traditional samurai behavior in favor of strange clothes, debauchery, and peculiar slang. They roamed the streets harassing townspeople, wreaking havoc and brawling with other gangs. Kyokaku or Street Knights were another gang and a natural enemy of the Kabuki Mono. They were vigilantes comprised of samurai and lower-class townspeople and were nominally protecting the people. The Kyokaku carried extra-long swords, shaved their traditional sideburns all the way up to the temple, and marked their allegiance with expensive fabrics worn draped over the shoulder or as neckerchiefs. Cool and mysterious as their vigilante antics might have seemed, Kyokaku were basically street thugs, and the violent clashes between them, Kabuki-mono, and the other factions provided the Edo period with a hefty helping of bloody gang violence. Everything must end eventually, and the samurai faced the music during a period known as Meiji Restoration. When the last Tokugawa shogun died in 1853 with no successor in sight, Japan plunged into a long period of turmoil that destroyed the shogunate and gave rise to Emperor Meiji, who took the throne in 1868. Meiji's government steered the country toward modern times by opening up to industrialization and Western influences and stripping away the samurai's power. The Meiji Restoration left an estimated 2/3 of the samurai class, over 2 million people, or about 6% of the total population, without a job. The remaining samurai were somewhat more fortunate as they were hired in new bureaucratic positions and found a fresh purpose as facilitators of Japan's social change.